The Dharma Bums, Chapter 2. The little St. Teresa bum was the first genuine Dharma bum I'd met, and the second was the number one Dharma bum of them all, and in fact it was he, J.P. Ryder, who coined the phrase. J.P. Ryder was a kid from eastern Oregon, brought up in a log cabin deep in the woods with his father and mother and sister. From the beginning, a woods boy, an axeman, farmer, interested in animals and Indian lore, so that when he finally got to college by hook or crook, he was already well equipped for his early studies in anthropology and later in Indian myth and in the actual texts of Indian mythology. Finally, he learned Chinese and Japanese and became an Oriental scholar and discovered the greatest Dharma bums of them all, the Zen lunatics of China and Japan. At the same time, being a Northwest boy with idealistic tendencies, he got interested in old-fashioned IWW anarchism and learned to play the guitar and sing old worker songs to go with his Indian songs and general folk song interests. I first saw him walking down the street in San Francisco the following week, after hitchhiking the rest of the way from Santa Barbara in one long zipping ride given me, as though anybody will believe this, by a beautiful darling young blonde in a snow-white strapless bathing suit and barefooted with gold bracelet on her ankle, driving a next year's cinnamon red Lincoln Mercury, who wanted Benzedrine so she could drive all the way to the city, and when I said I had some in my duffel bag, yelled, "Crazy, crazy." I saw JP loping along in that curious long stride of the mountain climber, with a small knapsack on his back filled with books and toothbrushes and whatnot, which was his small going to the city knapsack as apart from his big full rucksack complete with sleeping bag, poncho, and cookpots. He wore a little goatee, strangely oriental looking, with his somewhat slanted green eyes, but he didn't look like a bohemian at all, and was far from being a bohemian, a hanger-oner around the arts. He was wiry, suntanned, vigorous, open, all howdies and glad talk, and even yelling hello to bums on the street, and when asked the question answered right off the bat from the top or bottom of his mind, I don't know which, and always in a sprightly, sparkling way. "Where did you meet Ray Smith?" they asked him when we walked into the place, the favorite bar of the hepcaps around the beach. "Oh, I always meet my bodhisattvas in the street," he yelled and ordered beers. It was a great night, a historic night in more ways than one. He and some other poets, he also wrote poetry and translated Chinese and Japanese poetry into English, were scheduled to give a poetry reading at the Gallery 6 in town. They were all meeting in the bar and getting high, but as they stood and sat around, I saw that he was the only one who didn't look like a poet, though poet he was indeed. The other poets were either horn-rimmed intellectual hepcaps with wild black hair like Alva Goldberg, or delicate, pale, handsome poets like Ike O'Shea in a suit, or out-of-this-world, genteel-looking Renaissance Italians like Francis de Pavia, who looks like a young priest, or bow-tied, wild-haired, old anarchist fuds like Reinhold Cacotes, or big, fat, bespectacled, quiet boo-boos like Warren Coughlin. And all the other hopeful poets were standing around, in various costumes, worn at the sleeves corduroy jackets, scuffly shoes, bugs sticking out of their pockets. But JP was in rough working man's clothes he'd bought secondhand in Goodwill stores to serve him on mountain climbs and hikes and for sitting in the open at night, or for campfires, for hitchhiking up and down the coast. In fact, his little knapsack, he also had a funny green alpine. In his little knapsack, he also had a funny green alpine cap that he wore when he got to the foot of the mountain, usually with a yodel, before starting to tromp up a few thousand feet. He wore mountain climbing boots, expensive ones, his pride and joy, Italian make, in which he clomped around over the sawdust floor of the bar, like an old-time lumberjack. JP wasn't big, just about 5'7", but strong and wiry and fast and muscular. His face was a mask of woeful bone, but his eyes twinkled like the eyes of old giggling sages of China over that little goatee to offset the rough look of his handsome face. His teeth were a little brown, from early backwoods neglect, but you never noticed that he opened his mouth wide to guffaw at jokes, Sometimes he'd quiet down and just stare sadly at the floor, like a man whittling. He was merry at times. He showed great sympathetic interest in me, and in the story about the little St. Teresa bum, and the stories I told him about my own experiences hopping freights or hitchhiking or hiking in the woods. He claimed at once that I was a great bodhisattva, meaning great wise being or great wise angel, and that I was ornamenting this world with my sincerity. We had the same favorite Buddhist saint too, Avalokitesvara, or in Japanese, Kwannon, the 11-headed. He knew all the details of Tibetan, Chinese, Mahayana, Hinayana, Japanese, and even Burmese Buddhism, but I warned him at once I didn't give a goddamn about the mythology and all the names and national flavors of Buddhism, but was just interested in the first of Sakyamuni's Four Noble Truths. All life is suffering. And to an extent interested in the third, the suppression of suffering can be achieved, which I didn't quite believe was possible then. I hadn't yet digested the Lankavatara scripture, which eventually shows you that there's nothing in the world but the mind itself, and therefore all is possible, including the suppression of suffering. JP's buddy was the aforementioned boo-boo, big old good-hearted Warren Coughlin, 180 pounds of poet meat, who was advertised by JP privately in my ear as being more than meets the eye. Who is he? He's my big best friend from up in Oregon. We've known each other a long time. At first you think he's slow and stupid, but actually he's a shining diamond. You'll see. Don't let him cut you to ribbons. He'll make the top of your head fly away, boy, with choice chance word. Wow. He's a great mysterious bodhisattva. I think maybe a reincarnation of Asagna, the great Mahayana scholar of the old centuries. And who am I? I don't know. Maybe you're a goat? Goat. Maybe you're Mudface. Who's Mudface? Mudface is the mud in your goat face. What would you say if someone who was asked the question, does the dog have a Buddha nature? And said, woof. I say that was a lot of silly Zen Buddhism. This took JP back a bit. Listen, JP, I said. I'm not a Zen Buddhist. I'm a serious Buddhist. I'm an old-fashioned dreamy Hinayana coward of later Mahayanism, and so forth into the night. My contention being that Zen Buddhism didn't concentrate on kindness so much as on confusing the intellect to make it perceive the illusion of all sources of things. It's mean, I complained. All those Zen masters throwing young kids in the mud because they can't answer their silly word questions. That's because they want them to realize mud is better than words, boy. But I can't recreate the exact will-try brilliance of all JP's answers and comebacks and come-ons, with which he had me on pins and needles all the time, and did eventually stake something in my crystal head that made me change my plans in life. Anyway, I followed the whole gang of howling poets to the reading at Gallery 6 that night, which was, among other important things, the night of the birth of the San Francisco Poetry Renaissance. Everyone was there. It was a mad night, and I was the one who got things jumping by going around collecting dimes and quarters from the rather stiff audience standing around in the gallery and coming back with 3 huge gallon jugs of California Burgundy and getting them all piffed so that by 11 o'clock when Alva Goldbook was reading wailing his poem, Whale, drunk with arms outspread, everybody was yelling, go, 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 like a jam session. And old Reinhold Cacotes, the father of the Frisco poetry scene, was wiping his tears in gladness. JP himself read his fine poems about Coyote, the god of the North American Plateau Indians, I think, at least the god of the Northwest Indians, Quakyuk, and what all. Fuck you, sang Coyote, and ran away, read JP to the distinguished audience, making them all howl with joy. It was so pure. Fuck being a dirty word that comes out clean. And he had his tender lyrical lines, like the ones about bears eating berries, showing his love of animals, and great mystery lines about oxen on the Mongolian road, showing his knowledge of Oriental literature, even on to Xuan Sung, the great Chinese monk who walked from China to Tibet, Lan Chao to Kashgar, and Mongolia, carrying a stick of incense in his hand. Then JP showed his sudden barroom humor, with lines about Coyote bringing goodies, and his anarchistic ideas about how Americans don't know how to live, with lines about commuters being trapped in living rooms that come from poor trees felled by chainsaws, showing here also his background as logger up north. His voice was deep also. His background as logger his voice was deep and fucked up. Need to drink coffee. His voice was deep and resonant and somehow brave, like the voice of old-time American heroes and orators. Something earnest and strong and humanly hopeful I liked about him. While the other poets were either too dainty in their aestheticism, or too hysterically cynical to hope for anything, or too abstract and indoorsy, or too political, or like Coughlin, too incomprehensible to understand. Big Coughlin saying things about unclarified processes, though where Coughlin did say that revelation was a personal thing, I noticed a strong Buddhist and idealistic feeling of Japhe, which he shared with good-hearted Coughlin in their buddy days at college, as I had shared mine with Alva in the Eastern scene, and with others less apocalyptical and straighter, but in no sense more sympathetic and tearful. Meanwhile, scores of people stood around in the darkened gallery, straining to hear every word of the amazing poetry reading, as I wandered from group to group, facing them and facing away from the stage, urging them to glug a slug from the jug, or wandered back and sat on the right side of the stage, giving out little wows and yeses of approval, and even whole sentences of comment with nobody's invitation, but in the general gaiety, nobody's disapproval either. It was a great night. Delicate Frances de Pavia read, from delicate onion skin yellow pages, or pink, which he kept flipping carefully with long white fingers, the poem of his dead chum Altman, who'd eaten too much peyote in Chihuahua, or died of polio one, but read none of his own poems, a charming elegy in itself to the memory of the dead young poet, enough to draw tears from the Cervantes of chapter 7, and read them in the delicate Englishy voice that had me crying with inside laughter, though I later got to know Francis and liked him. Among the people standing in the audience was Rosie Buchanan, a girl with a short haircut, red-haired, bony, handsome, a real gonchick and friend of everybody of any consequence on the beach, who had been a painter's model and writer herself, and was bubbling over with excitement at that time because she was in love with my old buddy Cody. "Great, hey Rosie?" I yelled, and she took a big slug from my jug and shined eyes at me. Cody just stood behind her, with both arms around her waist. Between poets, Reinhold Cacotes in his bow tie and shabby old coat would get up and make a little funny speech in his snide, funny voice and introduce the next reader. But as I say, come 11:30, when all the poems were read and everybody was milling around wondering what had happened and what would come next in American poetry, he was wiping his hands with his handkerchief. And we all got together with him, the poets, and drove in several cars to Chinatown for a big, fabulous dinner off the Chinese menu, with chopsticks, yelling conversation in the middle of the night in one of those free-swinging great Chinese restaurants in San Francisco. This happened to be JP's favorite Chinese restaurant, Nam Yuan. He showed me how to order and how to eat with chopsticks, and told anecdotes about the Zen lunatics of the Orient, and had me going so glad, and we had a bottle of wine on the table, that I finally went over to an old cook in the doorway of the kitchen and asked him, why did Bodhidharma come from the West? Bodhidharma was the Indian who brought Buddhism eastward to China. I don't care, said the old cook with lidded eyes, and I told JP, and he said, perfect answer. Absolutely perfect. Now you know what I mean by Zen. I had a lot more to learn too, especially about how to handle girls, JP's incomparable Zen lunatic way, which I got a chance to see firsthand the following week.